The alarm didn't wake me. I was already awake. Lying on my back in a dark hotel room in Geneva, staring at the ceiling with a folder of documents on my chest that I'd been reading for 6 hours straight. My hands were steady. My breathing was not. Because what I had found, what was printed on those pages, was the kind of thing that ends careers or starts wars. I didn't know yet which one it would do to me. If you're new here, welcome. This channel tells stories that hit home. Stories about power, survival, and the people the world tries to erase. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. At 4:47 in the morning, the financial markets began to collapse. Not gradually. In great hemorrhaging waves that moved from New York to Tokyo to London in under 6 minutes. Defense networks stuttered. Intelligence feeds went dark. In the operations center of the Department of Homeland Security, 17 of the country's best analysts sat in front of their screens. None of them spoke, because none of them knew what to say. There was one man who could fix it. The call went out at 5:12 a.m. By 6:30, Caspian Vale's private aircraft had touched down at Reagan National. He sat in the back of an armored car moving through empty Washington streets, jacket unbuttoned, silver cufflinks catching the first gray light. He was 41 years old and had not been to this city in 3 years. He had designed it that way. Washington was a city of theater, all performance, no product. Caspian built things that mattered: code, infrastructure, systems that held the invisible architecture of modern civilization together. He did not need Washington until Washington needed him. The West Wing briefing room was already crowded when he arrived. Generals, intelligence directors, aides moving fast with coffee and printed briefs. President Adrian Knox rose from the head of the table to greet him. 44 years old, the youngest president in modern history, elected on charisma and carefully managed hope. He extended his hand with the ease of a man who had been photographed in moments of significance so many times that he had forgotten how to occupy moments of insignificance. Caspian shook it briefly. "Tell me the parameters," he said. It was then that Caspian saw her. She was standing at the far end of the room, navy dress, dark hair pulled back with precision, speaking quietly to an aide who nodded at everything she said. When the aide moved away, she turned, and her eyes met Caspian's across 12 feet of briefing table and 10 years of silence. The room kept talking. Generals presented slides. The intelligence director spoke about state actors. Adrian said something about timelines. Caspian heard none of it. Seraphina Moreau. The name moved through him the way cold water moves. Total, immediate, unavoidable. Adrian glanced between them. "Have you two met?" he asked. He said it easily, without suspicion. The question of a man who had not yet learned to read the grammar of history between two people. Seraphina spoke first. "We're acquainted." Her voice was exactly as Caspian remembered it. Precise. Unhurried. The voice of a woman who had learned long ago that words were instruments, and instruments were to be handled with care. "Years ago," Caspian said. Adrian nodded and moved on. What Adrian Knox did not know, could not know, was that Caspian Vale and Seraphina Moreau had once been engaged. What Caspian Vale did not know was that Adrian Knox had proposed to her years later. Each man believed he had been her great unfinished chapter. Neither understood that he had been, in her careful estimation, simply temporary. Caspian filed his reaction away in the locked interior room he kept for things too significant to feel in public. He turned back to the briefing screen. He asked about the breach parameters. His voice was level. His mind was not. The press conference was held on the South Lawn at noon. The White House and Vale Sovereign Systems, united for national security. The headline wrote itself. Cameras flashed in synchronized bursts. Adrian stood at the podium with practiced ease. Caspian stood to his left, hands folded, expression neutral. They shook hands again for the cameras. They smiled. By 3 p.m., the public alliance was official. By 4 p.m., the war between them had begun. It would be quiet. The kind that leaves no visible marks. Adrian's first move came before the press conference cameras had finished cooling. He called his chief of staff at 1:15 p.m. and gave one instruction: elevate Seraphina Moreau publicly. By 2 p.m., the official announcement had been drafted. She would serve as chief legal architect of the global cyber treaty. the most consequential international technology agreement in a generation. It was a meaningful appointment. And she was one of the finest international humanitarian lawyers alive, and she had earned every word of that title. But Adrian had not chosen her only because she deserved it. He had chosen her because proximity was its own form of influence, and he needed her close. Caspian's counter came 48 hours later. He did not use press releases. He used a reservation at a Georgetown restaurant that was quietly, impressively expensive in the way that required no visible effort. Corner table, low light, no aides. Seraphina arrived exactly on time. She sat across from him and opened the menu and said nothing until she had decided what she wanted. Then she set the menu down and looked at him directly, the way she always had. Like she was reading something printed behind his eyes. He had never fully gotten used to it. "I'm launching a humanitarian AI oversight fund," Caspian said. "I want you to control it." She studied him for a moment. "You don't trust the president." He didn't flinch. "I don't trust anyone who trades loyalty for optics." The remark landed. He had intended it to, because Adrian Knox had once, at a critical moment in her life, chosen optics over her. They both knew it. Neither said it. She picked up her water glass. She took a measured sip. She set it back down without a sound. "Tell me the structure of the fund," she said. The late-night policy sessions in the Roosevelt Room became a pattern. Adrian cleared the aides by 10 o'clock. Then it was just him and Seraphina across a table buried under legal briefs, treaty language, and half-empty coffee cups. He was sharper in these sessions than his public persona suggested. Genuinely engaged, capable of real intellectual precision when the cameras were gone. One night, around midnight, he looked up from a draft and said, "You deserve influence at the highest level." He meant it, with the specific sincerity of a man who believed that giving someone what they deserved and needing something from them could coexist without contradiction. Seraphina wrote a note in the margin of her brief. She said nothing. The media started circling by the end of the first week. Unnamed sources, that was always how it started. Headlines surfaced across 3 different outlets in the same 48 hours. The president, the billionaire, the woman. Profiles were written. Seraphina's photograph appeared in 4 separate publications. The framing was always slightly wrong. She was positioned as the object of a rivalry between 2 powerful men rather than the architect of anything herself. She read every article. She noted what they had gotten right. She noted, more carefully, what remained safely obscured. She never responded to a single one. Too composed, too prepared. 10 years earlier, she had been 31 and working out of Geneva. Senior associate at an international law firm, handling corporate governance, emerging technology compliance. She was considered one of the most promising legal minds of her generation. She was also at the time engaged to Caspian Vale. She had loved him with the particular intensity of someone who had finally met a person as exacting as herself. He was brilliant and relentless, and, in private, capable of a tenderness so carefully rationed that receiving it felt like something earned. She had understood that about him. She had been similar in her own way. That was what had made it work. That was also what had made what came next so precise a wound. In the course of routine compliance work, she came across a set of contracts: AI surveillance infrastructure, government procurement, standard regulatory documentation, on the surface. But Seraphina had always been careful with paper trails. She followed this one for 3 months, nights and weekends, tracing subsidiary relationships through 6 jurisdictions. What she found was not an anomaly, it was a system. Illegal data expansion programs operating beneath legitimate frameworks. On surveillance overreach violating the privacy laws of 4 countries. And, at the center of it, 2 names appearing with uncomfortable frequency. One was the company that would become Vale Sovereign Systems. The other was a rising political figure named Adrian Knox. She told Caspian first. She still remembered the exact quality of his silence when she finished. The way he sat very still, the way he looked at a point just past her left shoulder. Not at her, past her. The way people do when they're calculating rather than listening. "What are you planning to do with this?" he asked. "Make it public," she said. "Through the proper channels." He was quiet for a long moment. "The merger closes in 11 weeks. She understood exactly what he meant. The billion-dollar deal that would transform his company from significant to foundational. He was asking her to wait. to recalibrate her sense of what proper channels meant, to understand that the world was complicated. She had heard him. She had not agreed. She did not wait. 3 weeks after that conversation in Caspian's apartment, Seraphina submitted a formal disclosure to the Regulatory Compliance Division of the European Commission. Documented, organized, airtight. She had expected resistance. She had expected delays. What she had not expected was what actually happened. The scandal that erupted was not about the contracts. It was not about the surveillance programs. It was not about the collusion or the data or the 4 countries whose privacy laws had been systematically violated. The scandal that erupted was about her. Fabricated accusations surfaced through channels she could not immediately identify. Her professional ethics were called into question. Her personal life became public. Her judgment, her motives, her competence. All of it became material for discussion in rooms where she was not present to defend herself. A former colleague gave a quote to a financial newspaper. An anonymous source described her as unstable. 2 partners at her firm requested a review of her active caseload. She sat in her apartment the night the first article ran and read every word of it. Her name was in the headline. The corruption she had found was in the 14th paragraph. 3 sentences. Buried. She called Caspian at 11 p.m. He answered on the 4th ring. She told him what was happening. She told him about the article, the anonymous sources, the review at her firm. She did not ask him to fix it. She asked him to say publicly that what she had found was real. 4 words would have been enough. She found legitimate irregularities. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he was navigating a critical period, that the merger was in its final stage, and that a public statement would complicate everything, that it was temporary, that he was sorry. She listened to all of it. Then she hung up. She contacted Adrian 2 days later. He was in the middle of a Senate campaign. Traveling between 3 states, his assistant took her call and said he would get back to her. He called back that evening from what sounded like a hotel corridor. She explained everything again, the contracts, the data, the fabricated narrative now overtaking the real one. He listened carefully. He asked 2 clarifying questions. Then he said he was navigating a critical period. And she noticed he used the same phrase Caspian had used. She wondered if they had spoken. She would not find out for another 9 years. He told her he was sorry. He told her it was temporary. She did not hang up this time. She simply waited until he ran out of words. Within 6 weeks, her career was gone. Not dramatically. Not with a single decisive blow. It went the way real destruction usually goes, incrementally through a series of small withdrawals that each seemed individually survivable. The firm placed her on administrative leave pending review. The European Commission declined to move forward with her disclosure, citing insufficient procedural standing. 2 speaking invitations were quietly rescinded, or a fellowship she had been shortlisted for went to someone else. She resigned from the firm on a Tuesday morning. She packed 1 box. She did not say goodbye to the partners. She walked out through the glass lobby and did not look back. She moved to a small city on the coast of Portugal. She knew no one there. That was the point. She rented a 2-room apartment above a bakery and spent the first 3 weeks doing almost nothing. Walking to the water in the morning, reading in the afternoon, sleeping more than she had in years. She did not contact anyone from her former life. She did not read the news. She let the silence accumulate until it stopped feeling like defeat and started feeling like something else. On something she did not yet have a name for. It took 23 days. On the 24th morning, she woke up before sunrise, made coffee, and opened her laptop. She began to build a file. The file grew slowly at first. She was methodical. She had no access to the documents she had submitted to the European Commission. Those were now sealed in a procedural archive she could not reach. So she started over. Public records, corporate filings, leaked government procurement data published by investigative journalists in 3 countries. She cross-referenced. She mapped subsidiary relationships. She traced authorization chains through holding companies registered in jurisdictions designed specifically to obscure authorization chains. She worked 4 hours a day for the first 6 months, then 6 hours, then 8. The file became a folder. The folder became a drive. The drive became the most comprehensive private investigation of AI surveillance collusion ever assembled by a single person. She gave it no name. Meanwhile, the world kept moving. Caspian's merger closed. Vale Sovereign Systems became the AI backbone of cyber defense for 14 allied nations. Adrian Knox won his Senate seat by 11 points. 3 years later, he announced a presidential campaign. 4 years after that, he was inaugurated on a cold January morning on the steps of the Capitol. Seraphina watched the ceremony on a laptop screen in a rented office in Lisbon. She had moved from the apartment above the bakery. She needed more wall space. When the Chief Justice finished administering the oath, and Adrian turned to face the crowd with that calibrated smile, she reached across her desk and added a new document to the drive. Then she got back to work. By year 7, the drive contained documentation spanning 4 continents, 43 subsidiary companies, 19 government authorization chains, 11 jurisdictions, and a financial trail that connected illegal surveillance infrastructure directly to 2 men, one now running the most powerful technology empire on the planet, the other now sitting in the Oval Office. She had not rushed it. Rushing was how people made mistakes, and she could not afford a single mistake. And because the moment she moved, they would move faster. She had watched both men long enough to know exactly how they operated under pressure. She needed the case to be not just strong, she needed it to be unassailable. In year 8, she made her first contact, not with journalists, not with government officials, with a former NSA cryptographer named Elliot Marsh who had left the agency under circumstances that were never fully explained and now consulted privately for organizations that preferred not to be named. She flew to meet him in Reykjavik. They sat across from each other in a rented conference room for 6 hours. She showed him 3 folders. Not the full drive, 3 folders. And he spent 40 minutes on the first one, 20 on the second. He didn't finish the third. He looked up and said, "How long have you been building this?" 8 years, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" Elliot built her the encryption architecture, a delivery system that could not be traced back to a single origin point, designed to release the archive simultaneously to multiple recipients across different jurisdictions the moment a specific condition was met. He worked on it for 4 months. She paid him from a private fund she had established through a series of shell structures she had learned to build by studying the same methods the people she was investigating had used. When it was finished, Elliot sent her a single message. 4 words, "The door is built." She replied with 2, "Thank you." Then she began the final phase, timing. She chose the cyberattack crisis deliberately, not because she caused it. She did not. The attack was real, a state-sponsored incursion from an actor she had identified in her documentation 18 months earlier. But she had known it was coming. Elliot had confirmed the probability through channels she would never name publicly, and she understood that a crisis of that specific magnitude would force one outcome above all others. It would put Caspian, Vale, and Adrian Knox in the same room, and together, under pressure, with the world watching. That was the door she needed open. She had simply waited for the right moment to walk through it. Getting the appointment had taken 11 weeks of quiet maneuvering, 3 intermediaries, 2 formal recommendations from institutions that owed her nothing except the truth of her credentials, and 1 conversation with the president's national security advisor, a woman named Claudette Harris who had worked with Seraphina briefly in The Hague 14 years earlier, and remembered her with the specific respect that competent people reserve for people more competent than themselves. And when the appointment came through, chief legal architect of the global cyber treaty, Seraphina read the official letter twice. Then she placed it face down on her desk. She had not needed the letter. She had needed the access. The encrypted archive surfaced on a Thursday morning. She had released the first layer, not the full drive, a precisely selected portion, enough to destabilize, enough to make both men feel the ground shift beneath them, not enough to end either of them outright. Not yet. By noon, the markets were reacting. By 3, opposition leaders were using the phrase constitutional crisis. By 6, the president's approval rating had dropped 11 points. And in the offices of Vale Sovereign Systems, Caspian sat alone behind a closed door looking at a financial damage report that had grown by $800 million in 4 hours. His assistant knocked twice. He did not answer. Adrian called Caspian directly that evening. The line was swept for surveillance every 6 hours. He had not used it since taking office. The fact that he used it now told Caspian everything about the president's actual level of composure beneath the controlled public statements his press team had been releasing since noon. They spoke for 9 minutes. No aides, no record. They agreed on one thing only. They needed to see her. Not in the West Wing. On not in any room with cameras or logs or staff who could be deposed. Somewhere beneath all of it. Somewhere the architecture of accountability could not easily reach. Adrian knew exactly the place. The secure chamber beneath the east wing was accessed through a corridor that looked like a maintenance passage. Bare concrete, fluorescent strips, the smell of old stone and recycled air. Caspian arrived first. He stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides and looked at the single table, the 4 chairs, the 1 exit. Adrian arrived 3 minutes later. They did not greet each other. They stood on opposite sides of the table. The silence between them had a new quality now. Not the managed tension of 2 powerful men in strategic competition. Something rawer. The silence of 2 men who had just discovered the floor beneath their competition was not as solid as either had believed. Then the door at the far end opened. She walked in carrying nothing except a small drive between 2 fingers. No briefcase, no folder, no visible armor of any kind. She wore gray. Her hair was down for the first time either man had seen in years. She set the drive on the center of the table without ceremony, without drama, the way you set down something that has already decided everything before anyone in the room has spoken a word. Then she pulled out a chair, sat down. Mer looked at both of them with the specific calm of someone who has been waiting a very long time for a moment and is now simply inside it. "This contains everything," she said. Adrian's jaw tightened. "You've been building a case?" "For 10 years, she confirmed. The words landed differently than he expected. Not with aggression, not with satisfaction, simply as fact. The way a surgeon names a diagnosis. Caspian studied her from across the table. His eyes moved across her face the way they moved across complex systems, looking for the architecture beneath the surface. "You orchestrated this crisis," he said. "Not the attacks," she answered. She let a breath of silence sit between that sentence and the next. "But the exposure." "Yes." Neither man spoke. The fluorescent light above them hummed once, then went quiet. Caspian moved first. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, not in concession, in the way of a man who recognized that standing was no longer a meaningful position of advantage. Adrian remained standing for another moment. Then he sat too. The geometry of the room shifted. 3 people at a table now, not 2 men and a woman they had each believed they understood. 3 principles, equal in this room in a way that had never been true anywhere else. And Seraphina looked at Adrian first, then at Caspian. "You both abandoned me when it mattered," she said. Adrian moved to speak. She raised one hand. Small gesture, absolute in its authority. "This isn't about heartbreak." She said it without anger, which made it land harder than anger would have. She stood slowly and walked around the table, not pacing, moving with the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who has rehearsed nothing because they have simply lived this long enough to know exactly what they need to say. She stopped near the wall, turned back to face them both. "It's about systems." Then she began to explain it, the way she explained things in courtrooms. Precisely. Without ornamentation, with the confidence of someone who knows more about the subject in front of them than anyone else in any room they are likely to ever enter. The corruption that had destroyed her career had not been dismantled in the decades since. It had grown, refined itself, moved deeper into legitimate infrastructure. It now touched more lives, extracted data from more people who had no knowledge they were being extracted from. The surveillance programs she had originally documented had expanded into 7 additional jurisdictions. The financial pipeline feeding them had tripled in value, and the legal architecture protecting them had been strengthened twice. Once during Caspian's expansion into allied nation contracts, and once during the early months of Adrian's administration when 3 quiet executive authorizations had been signed without congressional review. She named every subsidiary. She cited every authorization. She traced every profit line without consulting a single note, because she had not needed notes for 3 years. Adrian's voice came out quieter than he intended. "You're blackmailing the President of the United States." She didn't flinch. She didn't pause. "I'm leveraging power." She said it the way you state the name of a tool, not with pride, not with apology, simply as the accurate term for the accurate thing. "You know the difference," she added. Caspian leaned back in his chair slowly. His eyes had not left her face since she began speaking, and he was looking at her the way he looked at systems he had underestimated, with the particular expression of a man recalibrating every assumption he had carried into a room. "You've outplayed us," he said. She corrected him without hesitation. "I've equalized the board." She laid out the terms, an independent AI oversight board structured specifically to prevent capture by the industries it was meant to regulate. Full transparency in federal technology contracts with real-time public disclosure requirements that could not be suspended by executive order. Expanded whistleblower immunity, broad enough to protect every person who came after her with evidence like hers. And the dissolution of the secret data mining subsidiaries currently operating in the gap between legal and illegal. The gap that both men's silence had spent a decade maintaining. "Funded jointly," she said. "Signed publicly." "Irreversible." She looked at each of them in turn. "If you refuse, I release the full archive, not the portion that is already public, everything, and neither of you survives politically." The room held the weight of that. Adrian looked at Caspian. Caspian looked at the table. Then he looked at Seraphina. "The Reform Initiative," Adrian said finally. "The Global Ethical AI Reform Act," she said. "I have the full legislative framework drafted, legal structure, implementation schedule, congressional briefing documents. You will have everything you need to present this as your initiative, both of you." A silence, not the silence of resistance, and the silence of two men absorbing the specific texture of having been comprehensively outmaneuvered and finding no remaining angle from which to push back. Adrian exhaled slowly. Caspian said nothing, but he reached forward and picked up the drive, turned it once in his fingers, set it back down. That was his answer. They sat in that room for another hour, working through logistics, not warmly, not with any pretense of collaboration beyond the purely functional. Adrian asked about congressional timeline. She answered with specifics. Caspian asked about the subsidiary dissolution structure. She answered with specifics. Every question they raised, she had already accounted for. Every concern they identified, she had already resolved in the framework. Yet at one point, Adrian looked up from the legislative summary she had placed in front of him and said nothing for almost 30 seconds. Then he said, "How long did this take you to draft?" She looked at him evenly. "Which version?" He understood what she meant. He looked back down at the document. He did not ask again. It was Caspian who asked the question. He asked it quietly, almost as a margin note to everything else, the way people ask things they have been carrying too long and can no longer justify continuing to carry. "Did you ever love either of us?" The room went completely still. Adrian stopped reading. Neither man looked at the other. Both looked at her. And for the first time in that chamber, and perhaps the first time in the entire sequence of events that had led them all to this room, something moved across Seraphina's face that was not controlled, not managed, not the expression of a woman navigating a negotiation. For 3 seconds, she was simply a person who had been asked a real question by someone she had once trusted entirely. Then she said, "Yes." She looked at Adrian first. "You loved ambition more." Not as accusation, as observation, the kind that is worse than accusation because it cannot be argued. Then she looked at Caspian. "You loved control more." Same tone, and Adrian's voice when it came was the quietest she had heard from him since she had known him. "And now?" She let the question sit for one full breath. "Now I choose impact." They left the chamber separately. Caspian first, then Adrian after waiting 5 minutes. Seraphina stayed in the room alone for a while after both of them were gone. She sat in one of the chairs and looked at the bare wall opposite her. She was not triumphant. She had not expected to be. Triumph was for people who had wanted a fight. She had wanted a correction. A systemic correction to a systemic wrong. That was not the same thing. She picked up the drive from the table, held it for a moment. He placed it in the inside pocket of her jacket, stood up, walked to the door, pressed her hand flat against it for 1 second before pushing through. Then she was gone. The announcement came on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks later. The East Room had been prepared with the specific care that White House staff reserve for events that will appear in history textbooks. Every camera angle considered, every light source adjusted, 2 teleprompters positioned, though neither man had needed one in years. Adrian spoke first from the podium. He was good. He had always been good in front of cameras. But today there was something different beneath the fluency, a gravity that was not performed, because he was saying something he had been compelled to mean rather than choosing to mean it on his own terms. The distinction was invisible to most people watching. It was not invisible to Seraphina, who watched from a monitor in a side room with a cup of coffee she had not touched. Caspian spoke second, briefly, in the precise language of a man who had restructured his thinking and his business simultaneously and saw no value in elaborating on the process publicly. He announced the dissolution of 3 subsidiary operations, the redirection of their former budgets into the oversight framework, a commitment to full federal contract transparency within 90 days. He did not look comfortable at the podium. He had never looked comfortable at podiums. But he looked like a man saying true things, which was, in its way, more compelling than comfort. When he finished and stepped back, Adrian extended a hand. They shook. Cameras fired in synchronized bursts. The headline was already writing itself in newsrooms across 12 countries. Markets stabilized within 48 hours. Adrian's approval rating climbed 9 points in the first week. Profiles appeared noting his bold legislative vision. Features ran on Caspian's unexpected pivot toward transparency and accountability. 3 international human rights organizations issued statements of support. The Global Ethical AI Reform Act moved through preliminary congressional review in record time. They carried by the specific momentum that gathers around something both inevitable and overdue. None of the coverage mentioned Seraphina by name in relation to the act itself. She had structured it that way deliberately. Her name appeared only in the official appointment records as chief legal architect of the Global Cyber Treaty. A different document, a different story. The real one remained where she had always kept it, underneath. Late evening, a rooftop in Georgetown, October air coming off the Potomac cold and clean. The city spread below her, monuments lit, the river a dark ribbon at its edge. Her phone had been buzzing for 3 hours. Colleagues from The Hague, human rights coalitions, a message from the Secretary General's office. She silenced it. She stood at the parapet and let the wind move and thought about nothing specific for a while, which was, for her, an extraordinarily rare thing. Behind her, in the city and in the structures of power that ran beneath the city like deep water, 2 of the most formidable men she had ever known maintained an alliance she had engineered. They would keep it. Not out of trust, out of understanding, which was, in her experience, considerably more durable. She had not chosen either of them. They had each understood her as something she was in relation to them. A chapter, a complication, a lever in their rivalry. Neither had understood her as the thing she was entirely independent of them. A woman who had spent 10 years doing the careful, unglamorous, exhausting work of assembling an irrefutable case against a system that had decided she was disposable. She had not done it for them. She had not done it against them. And power was not a thing to be held. It was a geometry, a relationship between forces. And the person who understood the geometry could move something enormous with very little weight of their own. She looked out at the city, her city now, in the sense that mattered, the sense of consequence. If this story stayed with you, that's the point. This channel exists for stories like this one, stories about power, patience, and the people who refuse to be erased. Hit subscribe so you never miss what we put out next. Like this video, it genuinely helps more people find us. Drop a comment below. Tell us what hit hardest. Tell us what you want to see next. We read every single one. Stay connected. The next story is already coming.